I've done it all. Traditionally published, indie published, YA fantasy, steamy paranormal romance, fairy tale retellings, and fantasy romance. And my personal favorite, the fantasy books set in the world I've been writing about since I was a kid. Hello and welcome or welcome back. I'm Lydia Foxglove, and I sold my first book to Bloomsbury under my real name in 2008. Since my video on what I learned writing 40 books in 4 years did pretty well, I've had a couple of requests for a video on what I've learned throughout my entire career, which it's been about 20 years since I started taking writing very seriously like a full-time job, and about 17 years, is that right? 16 years since I sold my first book. So let's get into it. And we're gonna go chronologically through the things learned because there are sort of stages of writing careers, I think. Not that everyone goes through all of these, but I think many of them are fairly universal. First, if you want to be published, understand why advice exists. Like, first, obviously, you need to study writing craft. You might attend some classes and conferences, you might read some books on writing, and you may have a critique group. And if you're a new writer, this could be scary, or you might just bristle at some of the things you hear. If you've studied writing craft at all, you've probably heard things like, there has to be conflict on every page, your protagonist has to want something and you have to take it away from them, use active voice and avoid adverbs, and kill your darlings, which means to cut anything that doesn't serve the story, even if you have a personal love of it. And when I first started, I would be resistant to a lot of this when it applied to my story. But then once you take the plunge, like I had a couple of friends who made literally every sentence in their entire novel in active voice. There was no passive voice in the entire book. And these books I was critiquing with no passive voice, there was something kind of uncanny about them. It was like too active, as if the entire thing had been rewritten into active voice by AI or something, even though we didn't have AI at that point. My favorite writer of all time is actually Ellen Montgomery, and she was writing in the early 20th century, so I kind of like older prose styles, and they did use adverbs and passive voice. And I still love the writing style. But meanwhile, I was getting some pretty harsh critiques that really picked apart my prose line by line and told me why this drags, this is boring, this is confusing, blah, blah. And I knew if I wanted to get an agent's attention, I should follow the rules. And in doing this, I learned that the true point of these rules is not to never break the rules. It's to realize why the rule exists. What are the common habits that all writers or many writers are getting into that just make their book draggy or boring or cliche or just plain unpleasant to read? Like if you're a fantasy novelist, you've probably heard that you shouldn't start books with a prologue. Obviously, this doesn't mean that a good book couldn't start with a prologue. Why does this rule exist? Because too many people were writing books with a long, ponderous prologue with like the gods talking to each other about a bunch of highfalutin concepts and names, and then suddenly you jump to like a farm boy and you would have no idea what the point of the prologue was. The real point of learning that rule is not to never write a prologue if you have a reason for it. It's to know why people are saying not to write a prologue. So if you're stuck in this early stage, study the rules, understand why the rules are there, and then break the rules if you want to. That really helped me get over that hurdle of knowing when to listen to a critique and when not to, and sort of what I was really learning here. Now, another thing with early stages of writers is that you might just have trouble finishing projects. This comes from both perfectionism and a lack of experience fitting together all the components of a plot. And the best way out is through. Just finish a story and then immediately start another story. And then after you finish story 2, then maybe go back to the first story and edit it and then start another story. I mean, you don't have to do it all in this order, but the point is finish stories. Don't get caught in total editing hell or middle of the book hell, where you insist to your brain that this must be perfect before it can be done or before anyone can see it. And you might be thinking, okay, I've heard that advice before, but how do I get past my stupid brain wanting to be all perfect about it? So the first book that I ever finished was because one of my good writer friends at the time, who was finishing her books, and we were both teenagers, so she was finishing like novel-length projects. She was like, if you're having trouble, just write an incredibly stupid ending. Like, make it as deliberately stupid as possible. You've written all these characters being delightful and having some serious and real conflicts. Now just throw something stupid at them and wrap it up like in the most half-assed way. And my brain was like, ugh. But I got her point. I just wrote an ending like it was a really bad superhero comic. The villain came in, he was like, time to take out the trash. I mean, it sounds stupid even saying it now. And then I did wrap everything up really fast and half-assedly, but it was the first time I was ever able to write the end on a novel. Obviously, it was bad, but it was a done thing of some kind. So then I got to wanting to do a second novel. So that first novel wasn't really salvageable. I was improving pretty quickly because I was quite young and writing a lot. So I threw that one away. Wanted to write another one. This time my friend and I had both been reading a series of teen romance novels set on a small island in Maine called Boyfriends, Girlfriends. We thought it was sort of a masterpiece and sort of horrible, which is kind of exactly the right note you want to strike with a book like that. But we both were like, we could do this. So she kind of dared us to write cheesy teen romances over the summer. This is the summer that I was 18 and all fueled up on this concept. I wrote a rambling but semi-decent book about a girl who finds out that she's a fairy and moves to a town where everyone is magical, and she falls in love with a 100-something-year-old vampire. Kind of a proto-Twilight, except with no sparkling, no eternal high school, no baseball, no watching Bella sleep, and probably no marketable elements. Still, it was done, and it was less terrible than the last one, and you might see what was happening here. Just telling myself to write terrible books was taking all the pressure off. I actually was finishing stuff, and the first book was abysmal, and the second book was just kind of normal bad, and the third book was the one that eventually became my debut novel, Magic Under Glass. The first book I ever sent out agent queries for was the Fairy Vampire book, but I finished the book when I was 18, and I sent the queries when I was 23, which is also when I started writing Magic Under Glass. And you might wonder what was going on in that 5-year period. To put it simply, I was terrified of rejection, and I love to tell you that that feeling gets better and I've conquered it. But to this day, rejection remains kind of terrifying. The horrible review, the book that just completely flops, it's still just I'm sorry, but writing a book, even my most quickie to market book, like, I think I am incapable of writing tens of thousands of words and not putting at least a little piece of my heart and soul into the book. And it just sucks to have your heart and soul rejected. I can objectively acknowledge that rejection and critique and criticism are just a part of art and life, but it never really stops stinging a little bit. But what helps me to get over that is just to focus on the next book. Because when I was sending out that first book, it felt like the book. And that was partly what made it terrifying. Like, this is the book. If you reject this one, what then? If you start writing another book, well, now the book that is on submission, or the book you've just published if you're an indie, is no longer the book. And the new book is fresh. No one's ever told me what's terrible about it. It's just a nice, warm, cozy place for me to traumatize my characters. Someone on an indie writer group I was in recently freaked out that they'd given away like 1,000 copies of a book that either they sent out in the wrong file or they realized it had issues and it was getting bad reviews. Anyway, I realized that when you're in the early days of a writing career, every little thing feels like that. Oh my God, what a horrible mistake. This is going to taint me for a long time. 1,000 downloads is nothing. Even 1,000 sales, like, that's a lot, but in the scheme of all the people in the world, it's not that many. If you write a book and it's terrible, at least you did something. and the next one will be better. And as you keep going, you will continue to improve. This is not to say, though, that you shouldn't ever do many editing passes. I rewrote Magic Under Glass completely, like 3 times. But before you get too caught up in editing passes, I would try to finish the next thing. You want to get used to finishing things before you get into this endless editing loop. And this brings me to 2008 and the proper start of my writing career. At this point, the biggest problem I faced was no longer the writing craft itself. It was envy and jealousy. When you publish a book, there will be a small minority that hits big success right from the start. Although this didn't happen to me, I've known enough people that it's happened to know that it comes with its own problems like imposter syndrome, intense scrutiny, terror over following up with a book that's as good as the one everybody loved. I mean, I look at a book like The Fourth Wing, and that wasn't her first book either, but the amount of intense love and intense scrutiny that book got, like, is kind of terrifying to me. I think it would be very hard to deal with that emotionally and mentally, especially like the first time it happens to you. Maybe if you have a long career and every book you write becomes lauded, maybe you start to shake it off. I don't know. But most authors are going to end up feeling like they kind of underperformed, or maybe you perform about as well as you expected because your expectations weren't that high to begin with. But either way, you're not hot stuff. No one is clamoring for you. This is especially hard in traditional publishing because when you get signed with a book deal, you will get the most glowing compliments. Everyone's so excited about you. And then if the book comes out and it fizzles, it's like you won't even hear from anyone sometimes. It's kind of like you just feel like you've just kind of shriveled up and no one even sees you. And there is a high likelihood at this point that you have made at least one author friend who did pretty well. Meanwhile, you have been weighed, you have been measured, and you have been found wanting. A Knight's Tale, 2001. And it sucks. This might even be one of your critique partners, and you both read each other's books, and you were pumping each other up, like, yeah, it's great, you know, you might want to tighten this part a little, but I really love it, I'm so excited for you. And then you both sell, and suddenly they're on like an 11-city book tour and buying a new car, and you are getting an engagement at your local library attended by your grandma and your neighbor, and you go out to a sushi dinner, but you don't get the sushi boat. You're not that fancy. And then your publisher doesn't even want your next book, and then you get like the publisher's weekly email that says, your best friend just signed a new 7-figure book deal. And you don't want to be jealous for your friend. You want to be happy for them. This is something so amazing that's happening to them. But you're only human. You've worked hard too. You probably feel like you've done the same amount of work and maybe written a book that's just as good. But the world doesn't love you. They love your friend. Your feelings are very normal. If I could go back and tell my younger self just how normal it is to feel that way, and the best way to deal with it is not to start gossiping about that friend with other mutual friends that are also feeling jealous. But over years of doing this, a certain peace settles in. Some of these hot authors will not maintain this level of success. Some people who started out struggling for years will suddenly have something that really does well. Another one of your friends was doing well, but then they got hardcore burnout and they just couldn't write for 3 years. Or some terrible thing happened to them that wasn't even writing related at all. Then you really feel kind of bad that you were ever jealous of them. And then you might have another friend who has not had any success in 20 years of trying, but they're such a kind and amazing person. You hate the idea that they would feel like a failure when they're just such a wonderful human being. So I have tried to bring some of that energy back to myself, not to beat myself up over my failures either. On the flip side, you might hit a point where you do have a big success. Suddenly everything feels like it's going very right, better than you expected. And this is its own kind of freaky. It's very distracting, and it's just like a big dopamine rush, especially if you are indie published and you can check your numbers moment by moment. It's kind of like anxiety producing for me when I have something like really pop for a short amount of time beyond any of my expectations, because it gets into my head. Part of me is planning my glorious future where it just keeps going better and better. The other part of me is like, oh my God, something terrible is going to happen because everything's going so well. And then another part of me just like can't sleep. That dopamine rush will not last. Your success probably won't stay at that level either. Try not to let it distract you. Again, just try to keep doing the work. But if right at this moment you're feeling like a bit of a failure for whatever reason, know that it is quite possible that in 10 years you will be in a completely different place that you can't even imagine right now. This is especially true if you are watching and you're under 30, because I know for me the 20s were just this time where I felt like I had to get everything right at this point. I had to set up my career. I had to be good at all the things I was doing and successful. Life is not actually like that. Some people get started much later. Some people don't even start their career until they retire. Whether you're doing well or poorly at the moment, things are going to keep changing and evolving. You're going to have new insights. You're going to develop new skills. You're going to end up in a different place that you couldn't have imagined. If you're planning on pursuing a creative life long term, it's best to just acknowledge right now that you and all your peers in the same field will go through many ups and downs. And it's not over until you decide that it's over. Your big success could be just around the corner, but it's also perfectly fine to change your mind about the whole thing and do something else. And speaking of changes, another thing I've learned over the years is not to be afraid to pivot, to just reimagine everything. I've made several big pivots in my life. In fact, this YouTube channel is just my latest pivot in a series of pivots that seem to occur every 5 years or so. Each one has brought successes and challenges, but it's always a little hard to make that first leap and commit to something that's new and leave behind the old thing that you know isn't maybe quite working for you, but it is what you know. In fact, one of the best things that I've done lately is get the job at the used bookstore. You're gonna hear sounds of cats playing in the background, I think. By the way, thank you for all your condolences on my cat dying. I've still been crying about it, but we did get 2 new cats, which we didn't intend to. We meant to get 1 new cat, but you know how it goes when you go to the shelter. So we have 2 new cats now, along with the 2 older cats. And the new cats are younger and they periodically make a lot of noise running around like little hellions. Don't climb on the counter. Oh my goodness. That's quite a maneuver. Anyway, I got this job at a used bookstore, and I also asked the owner if he was interested in selling vintage clothing there, because I had some that I'd grown out of, and I thought, hey, he already had a clothes rack. Can I just throw it on there? It started to sell right away, and the vintage clothing business has been doing really well, and I also love books, obviously, so I've really enjoyed selling books and talking to people about books, and most people who shop there never even know that my main gig is a writer. They just assume that my main gig is a used bookseller and vintage clothing seller. And there's kind of something very relaxing about that, to just be there and just have the cutest, tiniest little small town cozy romance job that you can imagine and talk to people in the community. If it wasn't for these stories, they're just burning up inside me all the time, I would probably be perfectly content just to keep building up that business until it could sustain 2 people full time. So I can really recommend that if your creative endeavors are getting you down, just go do something else for a little while. Sometimes it really helps, but you need to trust your gut on all of these things, pivots to different directions, different jobs. You'll kind of know when it's time to try something new, which isn't to say that it won't still be scary. Know that I'm wishing all the best for you and all of your creative endeavors. And I'm curious to know if you've ever had to make a big pivot in your creative life or your business. I've also been getting a lot of requests for marketing advice, which is kind of hilarious. You should probably listen to someone else. With that said, I didn't mention anything I've learned about marketing in this video, but that seemed like it needed to be its whole own video, and it's probably gonna be all mistakes. I mean, not really, but most of the things that work don't seem to work anymore, so I'm kind of figuring it out too. Maybe I should ask you guys for marketing advice. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, as always, please like and subscribe. I try to post once a week normally about the creative life in general and fantasy writing in particular, both the emotional and the practical side. I've also started a weekly post on Substack and Patreon where I answer questions I've been getting in the comments. So if you want more of that, sign up for one of those. Same content on both. And as I film this, it's all free. I don't know how that will go over time, but thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Oh, you bastard. I'm out of kombucha.